Hi guys, thanks very much for joining me, and I'm going to make another video that is looking at A-level, AQA A-level Modern British History, and we're going to be focusing on this idea of anti-establishment culture during that period 1987 to 1997. As always, I put videos up fairly regularly. There's quite a bank of videos there already, so subscribe, then you'll see when there's additional videos being put up. But today's video is focusing on anti-establishment culture 1987 to 1997, during that period when John Major is Prime Minister. So, if we're going to understand what we need to be looking at for this, our notes are going to be broken down into three key areas. We're going to look at monarchy and how the public perception of monarchy changes and the reasons for that throughout that period. We're then going to be looking at the arts and popular culture during that period and how that changes. And then finally, we're going to look at environmental protest movements. Throughout, I'm going to try and make links for you backwards, and also going to try and get you to think about how things connect that a little bit more, okay? And that should help you when you are planning and writing your essays in the future. I think a useful starting point though, whenever we look at something like this, and particularly with my students, what I do is I always like to go back. What was it like before 1987? Because we need to understand that process of change. And a really good example here is the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, which took place in the 1950s. And if you look at footage from that time, newspaper headlines from that time, and look back at your notes from that period, you'll see this is very much a deference to monarchy, a deference to the establishment. People knew their place, and generally, people accepted their place. So we had the class society, lower class, middle class, upper class, or working class, middle class aristocracy, that kind of idea. And people, respected the monarchy. So I want to understand how that changes then. So in the 1950s we have that, and then during this period 1987 to 1997, that changes, and I want to understand why. Well, first of all, there is a general decline in the respect for the establishment. People have started to question it. We can go look back all the way to the perfumer affair for that, but that questioning of the establishment and whether they know best and whether we should be respectful to them has started to carry on, and we're seeing it more and more prevalent during this period. Also, what happens during this period is 3 of the Queen's children, their marriages break down, and it's quite a public breakdown for each of them. It's reported in the media. The media is quite critical of them. And what we see is things that wouldn't have been written in the 1950s are now appearing as newspaper headlines during this period, 1987 to 1997. So we've got a really good example here of people questioning the monarchy and the media questioning the monarchy and questioning the role of the monarchy. That is only exasperated. It gets worse when in 1992 there is a fire at Windsor Castle. Windsor Castle is the Queen's residence outside of London, and there's quite a significant fire there, and there is a question over who will pay for the repairs. Initially the government say the taxpayer, the public will foot the bill, and that begins to be questioned when they say, well, the Queen and the royal family are quite wealthy, they're extremely wealthy, why are we paying this bill? And as a result, there is an agreement made that the Queen will start to pay for some of that bill. She will foot more of the cost than had initially been anticipated. And that then leads to further questions that the Queen and the royal family are wealthy, and up until this point they had not paid tax on their private income. And after the fire and after a review of the monarchy, there is an agreement made where the Queen voluntarily agrees to pay tax on her private income. We also have this idea within the monarchy of the civil list, okay? This wider monarchy of, we could start with the Queen and then, or at that time the Queen, then you would have gone to Prince Philip, you would have gone to Prince Charles, now King Charles, and this wider monarchy. And at the time the civil list was quite wide. You would end up with many dukes, duchesses, people that generally hadn't been heard of, but were still being funded on the civil list. that meant the public, the taxpayer, funded those activities for those members of the royal family, which were often described as official engagements, but there was a perception by the public that that was dubious, and therefore the Queen made an agreement that the civil list would be reduced. The number of members of the royal family that would be funded by the taxpayer was reduced. So we're now seeing two things that have definitely happened. The Queen is now going to be paying tax, and also the civil list has been reduced. There's also sympathy in the media for Princess Diana. Princess Diana and Prince Charles had divorced, they'd separated, and then they were going to divorce. Their marriage had collapsed, and there was general sympathy towards Princess Diana. The royal family were portrayed as being cold and aloof, and Princess Diana was very much portrayed as the victim, rightly or wrongly, but the media portrayed it that far. However, despite all of this, it's key that you know that we aren't seeing the call for a republic happen in the United Kingdom. We've still got over 70% of the population supporting the idea of the monarchy. People still feel that Britain would have been worse off without a monarchy at this period. So I've given you some really good examples of this idea of where people are questioning the monarchy, but it's important you balance that with this idea or this knowledge that over 70% of the public still felt that Britain would be worse off without a monarchy. So let's move on. We've looked at the royal family, the monarchy. Now I want to look at the arts and popular culture. And again, if we look back, particularly in the 60s, well in the 50s, we see the Angry Young Men, the playwrights. The 60s, we started to see changes in television, changes in censorship. Things like Cathy Come Home appear on television, and we start to see a modernisation of the idea of what we see on television, changes in theatre and things like that. So changes in arts and popular culture are not a new thing in this period. It's a progressing thing, but we need to focus on what happens in this period, 1987 to 1997. Well, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this movement of the young British artists. And we see a growth in this idea of popular artists such as Tracey Emin and Damien Hirst, who challenge the perceptions of what art is. To the extent where Tracey Emin places on display a tent with names embroidered inside of it. It's literally a tent that you could almost buy at a camping shop, and she's embroidered names within it of people who she slept with, and that goes on display as art. Damien Hirst is displaying modern art. For example, he displays a shark, a dead shark, in formaldehyde, and that is classed as a piece of art as well. So there's this challenging of perceptions of what is art and what is not art, and quite often the mainstream media really do kind of resent this. They're saying that's not art, we're being taken for a ride. A big backer of the young British artist movement is Charles Saatchi. Charles Saatchi is of Saatchi and Saatchi fame, the Conservative Party campaign which saw Labour isn't working, that kind of stuff. That's Saatchi and Saatchi. But in this case, Charles Saatchi is the patron of the movement. This means he's really funding it. He's a supporter of it. He's buying their art. And then in 1997, so right at the back end of this period that we're looking at, he puts on a display called Sensation. He puts on an exhibition called Sensation. And it causes outcry because we see images that aren't traditionally art, and then significantly a portrait is put on display of the child killer Myra Hindley, the Moors murderer. And this really causes outrage in mainstream media. So we're seeing these ways that the arts and popular culture are challenging conventional ideas. Youth culture also changes. Now don't forget, we've seen the mods, the rockers, the teddy boys, the skinheads, the punks, the hippies. All the way through we've seen change. And now we enter a period which is kind of known as the rave scene. So it's very much dance music, very much techno music based, and this idea of what's known as acid house. And there is very much a drug culture associated with it. And again, that is not new. All the way back to the 60s and 70s, drugs have been associated with the youth movement. But there's moral panic when we see illegal parties and things like that. And in response, the government bring out legislation. So a really good example here of how the anti-establishment culture causes the government to respond to this is in the passing of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994, which gives the police the right to confiscate equipment being used at these parties, gives them the right to break up these events, and even goes down as far as to give a legal definition of what techno music is, and it talks about it being a repetitive beat over a period of time. So even the music is given a legal definition at this point. So we've done monarchy, we've done the arts and popular culture, and therefore it won't come as a surprise to you that the last one we're going to look at is the environmental protest movement. And again, if we think back, 1970s we started to see that. We saw the Ecology Party, we saw Greenpeace, the foundation, not the birth, the foundation of Greenpeace in 1991, and then we saw Friends of the Earth. But this movement has carried on. This has been carrying on. So now we're moving into the late 1980s, and we start to see this idea of direct action taking place. Again, some significant real developments. And I've put some examples up in the PowerPoint for you, but we're seeing Twyford Down, the M3 extension there in 1992, the M11 Link Road, and the Newbury Bypass. These were all significant events in the media at the time. And what you start to see is national movements who are against these environmental changes come together with local residents who don't want these changes, don't want large roads, essentially in their back gardens, so to speak. And what we see as New Age travellers as well, which previously you would probably describe as hippies, but now they're given this term of New Age travellers. And these groups of people come together in protest. Significantly, what you start to see is some of the New Age travellers take on different methods of protest. So we start to see them chaining themselves to trees, climbing trees to make it difficult for them to be extracted, making it impossible to cut the tree down because the protester is now inside the tree, and also digging tunnels underneath these places as well. A famous character from the time was somebody known as Swampy, and he became notorious for digging these tunnels and staying underground and making it impossible for the developers to carry on work until he'd been extracted, until the other protesters had been extracted. So these are really clear examples of how the anti-establishment culture changes over that period and how it influences wider society. So, a summary of what we've looked at then, we've seen an increasing questioning of the establishment and the monarchy. We've seen the arts and youth culture challenge traditional ideas of art, and that's often causing offence, or certainly offence within the wider media. And then we see environmental protests increase and this idea of direct action. Okay? However, and I have said this again, if you look at that PowerPoint, many of these changes have got their roots in previous periods as well. So smart thinking, you've got to be able to do this. You've got to be able to make these connections, okay? It's no good just thinking that this is it on its own and nothing else happened. And also, you should be able to make the connections of how does anti-establishment culture affect other things during that period as well. How does wider social change take place? So that leads us to think about an exam style question where you would require this knowledge. And I've given you an example here. It hasn't appeared on a past paper. It is literally one I've made up. And it is the period 1987 to 1997 was a period of large social change. Assess the validity of this view. It will be 25 marks. And I've said at the bottom here, you're going to need that wider knowledge of social liberalism as well, though. You're going to need to understand feminism. You're going to need to understand race relations. And I'll make videos about those as well in the future. But make sure you've got that wider knowledge to make those connections with regards to anti-establishment culture and why that is the reason people are questioning the establishment, why social art is changing, why popular art is changing, and also why environmental protests take place. If you've got any questions, by all means add them into the comments below here. Don't forget, click on subscribe. That means you're going to get updates of anything else I put up here as well. Other than that, I'll leave you to it. Thank you very much. Bye bye.